The New Testament passage for this morning has both the deep pain of despair, but it also has the joy and celebration of reunion. Our text asks us to look at one of the most agonizing scenes and see there the amazing response of our God. I'll be reading from Luke's Gospel, chapter 7. It's verses 11 through 17, which is on page 839. It is the widow of Nain. Soon afterwards, he went out to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. As he approached the gate of the town, a man who had died was being carried out. He was his mother's only son, and she was a widow, and with her was a large crowd from the town. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her, and he said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came forward and touched the bier, and the bearer stood still, and he said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." And the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized all of them, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has looked favorably on his people." This word about him spread throughout Judea and all the surrounding country. Here ends our reading. Thanks be to God. Will you pray with me, please? Dear God, there are painful places in our lives. There are moments that defy words to help or explain. We turn to Scripture with hope that there is something here, or there is some message for us to feel, to experience this day. We would pray that you would find a way to assure us and to hold us, to set us right once again, that we might move forward as your people into this world that needs your love. Amen. For the first Sundays of Advent, we've gathered and we have worshipped with a festive spirit. Christmas is coming, and we decorate, we get ready, we sing those songs that warm our hearts, that stir us to remember Christmas is past and to think about the future with hope. And this Sunday now we are still in Advent. We gather to worship, but there is this shadow of despair with the killings that have happened in Connecticut. Once again, a gunman with enough weapons for his own war brings the nation to a time of shock and grief. How do we begin to understand what has just happened once again? What words can we use to describe what we are feeling? We are a nation in grief, striving to understand, as a nation, but then also individually, we will process this tragedy in our own way. And we've got to grieve. We've got to grieve first and grieve well before anything good can happen from here. And I turn to this story from Luke because in Advent we wait for the one who comes to bring peace. We wait for the birth of a child who will show us how to live with one another and how to love our neighbors as ourselves. We wait for one who would die for us, to show us that death doesn't have the final say. soon there will be parents burying children. The widow in this story is leading a funeral procession for her son. Custom said that that's what she had to do. She had to be in the front, in that spotlight, everyone seeing her suffering. She had to lead that procession for her son, to walk to the burial ground. She's already too familiar with this path. She's a widow, and she has already done this difficult task as her husband was buried. And what we see in the text this morning is death at its worst. There's a young widow who is burying her only child. And not only is her family gone, and she's very much alone, in this day and age, suddenly she would have no legal standing. There are no claims for support for her in the community. In ancient Israel, the oldest son carried the obligation to support his mother through her old age. And suddenly that safety net is gone for her. And what can she rely on now? She can't count on much at this point. She would have to beg for charity of others for her very survival. She's alone. She is so desperately alone, and things look helpless for her. Now, not all of us have experienced a death as immediately as this widow in the story. Some have. As we journey through life, there are many ways in which our hearts can be broken open. Along with her broken heart, we might well sense with her, like a country is failing, this bewilderment and this abandonment as to why is all of this suddenly being laid at her doorstep. Why should she outlive her child? Why should she have lost her husband? She, like the psalmist, cries out, "Lord, have you forgotten me? Where are you?" Painfully in each of our lives, there are those points when we come to that moment when the only words that can leave our lips are why. Why, dear God? Why? Why is our loved one dying of cancer? Why do I feel so alone or abandoned at times? Why did this awful thing happen to me and my family? Why did this awful thing happen to us and our country? We don't have to look far at all these days to find big doses of suffering. Imagine this widow, not wanting to be at the center of attention, and yet somehow she's got to be at the forefront of this procession, leading the group to the waiting burial site. All of her suffering, all of her grief is right there for the community to observe. That everyone there would be experiencing it in some way. There are some people who would know. Everybody knows the trouble that she has seen. And the presence of others just reminds us of how public her grief was. The whole town knew of her loss and would have showed up for this funeral. Now there would be some who would come to just see what's happening. They may feel little or no emotional connection to the widow. There would be those who didn't know the boy or know his mother. And yet they're reminded of their own loss. They can empathize with her. And then there are the close friends who are feeling at a complete loss for words of what can you do or say in the midst of this moment as she has entered this incredibly difficult place, and she's now facing yet another transition in her life. Each one of the crowd is affected in a different way. It's the same event that they are participating in, and yet each one sees it through the lens of their life experience. And as we look at this story today, as we hear of the tragic deaths at the elementary school, each one of us will see that event, will experience it in a different way. Some of us may be remembering loved ones who died too soon. We might resonate with the pain of the widow. We might feel more that we're part of the crowd. We hear the news of what has happened. We didn't know any of them personally, and yet we're saddened because our nation is like that. How could these things be? We might be frustrated at trying to wonder how will things ever change or get better from here. We might try to offer words of comfort to one another. What do we say to our children in moments like this? How do we offer grace and assurance to those who are feeling great pain? Or what can you say when there are no words to say? Now, we know very little of this woman in the story. There's certainly nothing in our story that gives us any idea that somehow she deserved to have her son restored to life, or that she deserved the pain that she was going through so far. She's simply hurting. And Jesus didn't plan to encounter this event. He just happened upon it. And what a beautiful and powerful and tender moment when Jesus, he is on his way and he sees what is happening. He goes to the head of this procession. He joins with her with all of the attention that is focused on her. He goes to her and says, "Do not weep." He sees her pain and he moves toward it. God knows her pain and responds to it. God, through Jesus, is part of this world, and he does suffer. He suffers with and he suffers for her. God's not stoic and standoffish. God is with her as she encounters all of the painful places of her life. And consider, too, how the crowd reacts to all of this. The son is called back to life. And they respond first with fear and then with praise. Jesus brings this boy back to life and gives him back to his mother. And the crowd is filled with fear. And then there's the realization of the grace that is present right there. It filters through the crowd and everyone turns to praise. Here's a gift of life that has come in this place of death. It's a gift of life from God. This is Jesus saying that death doesn't have the final say. The boy will hopefully grow then and experience a full life, but he will die again. Pain and death haven't been eliminated here in this moment, but it is that moment that Jesus enters in and says it isn't how the story ends. There's a Greek word for cure, and what it means is the repair of a fractured soul. And I think as a nation and as individuals, our souls get fractured. There are parts of our lives as we look at ourselves and say, we wish for a cure here. We wish there be healing. And I think in order for there to be that salvation, that wholeness, that cure that comes with the grace of God, first there has to be a recognition and an acknowledgement of the pain that is there. Without the recognition of need, there is no place for grace. And that is hard for us to look within, to say, this is our own area of need. We have to do that first, whether it's I'm scared, I'm unsure, I'm grieving, I'm at a loss. If we can find that spot, if we can acknowledge that, we don't have it all together. We never have and we never will. It's that place that can be open to grace. For each one of us, Jesus finds a way to enter into our world. Jesus finds a way to reach out and will encounter us, will break through to us. We are now, or we will someday, be part of this procession sometime in our lives, whether we're right up front in the activity, with our pain being what the world sees and focuses on, or whether we are there for someone else and we're part of the crowd. Jesus is there for us all. We're never alone. And we're to look for those ways in which Jesus may stop and put a hand out and offer an embrace and call life into places where it seems as though death has seized its prey. And today that love and comfort and grace, I think, is found in the relationships that we develop with one another, when we can offer kind words of support to each other in times of need. It is by our actions that we can convey God's love for all of us as we experience great times of pain. In this story this morning, what Jesus shows us is that the suffering of others cannot be disregarded. We can't just walk past and look the other way. We're not insulated or isolated from the lives of others. In the future, I think that it's going to be recognized that along with cancer or AIDS, those aren't the biggest killers that can bring us to the end of our earthly days. I think it will come to be known that loneliness and hopelessness and despair can be just as lethal. The temptation to turn away from somebody else's suffering can be so strong. It's hard to acknowledge the reality of the pain of death, that sting can be so strong that we don't want to stay in that place for very long. And while we can't bear the cross for others, we can help others carry their burdens. When we spend time with others, comforting them, somebody with a broken heart, we are doing that same work that Jesus did that day in Nain, helping to bring life again. We may not have had that same experience of pain that we see in another, but we know we can reflect on our own lives and have empathy for a sense of loss. And we can help those in pain by feeling connected to a sense of community. You're not alone with what you're going through. And it's simple things. It's holding hands. It's wiping tears. It's sharing a hug. It's crying out loud. It's saying why. And when we ask why, the solution lies not in words or in sermons or in explanations or grasping at answers that don't really make any sense. The answers are found in faithful friendships. People who sit with us in the rubble of our lives and say, I don't know. When you don't know, say, I don't know. Answers are found by living with the questions. So let's look for those times when Christ is entering into our lives with that strange command, weep not. I think we can weep first, but know and trust that God will wipe away every tear in time. The story gives us hope as we look for that which is transcendent in our lives. We know that we're not alone. We know that God is with us in our times of pain and powerlessness. Pain will be met by grace, and we're always going to have both in this life. With Christ, there is the movement from dark to light, from despair to confidence. We're not alone with our pains, and we have the presence of family and friends. We have a community of faith that surrounds us, but mostly, always, what we have is the love of our God who does not let us go. May it be so for you and for me, this day and always.